context for the presentation I'll make today. This was a talk I originally gave in August of 2018 at the Society of American Archivists conference in Washington, DC. It was part of a panel of papers that was convened by Elliot Wilczek, a colleague in the archives community, about archival intersections with wicked problems. And Elliot very kindly provided an introduction to the concept of wicked problems, which I won't be able to do justice to, but I will try to summarize. My fellow presenters that day were Era Tanzi, who spoke about archives and records of climate change as a wicked problem, preservation of narratives about climate change as a wicked problem, and Anne Gilliland, our own faculty member in the Department of Information Studies, who spoke about record keeping and refugee communities as a wicked problem. So wicked problems are, in contrast to tame problems or soluble problems or approachable problems, a concept that emerged in management science in the 1960s and was refined in the 1970s, particularly by scholars Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber, who defined wicked problems as having 10 unique and defining characteristics. The first of which is that there is no definitive formulation of a wicked problem. It's amorphous, it's always changing. There is no stopping rule for a wicked problem. Nobody can say where the problem begins or ends. It's a little bit like a snake eating its tail. Solutions are not binary or unitary, but they are continuum based. It's not a question of, yes, we have solved it, no, we have not, but is this situation better or worse? Is this a better or worse approach to this problem? There isn't an immediate or ultimate test to the solution either. There isn't a way to say that this problem has been solved, it has merely evolved. There's no possibility for trial and error. When you have implemented a solution or an approach to that problem, you have changed the nature of the problem itself. Every wicked problem is unique. It doesn't have a well-defined or well-described set of solutions that can be applied to it. It can be considered a symptom of another problem as well as the start of other problems in itself. And they're narrative in nature. How you describe the problem dictates how you propose to solve the problem. And there are multiple competing and equally valid ways to talk about the problem. So homelessness, is this a problem of property and people having homes? Is it an economic problem? Is it a social problem? How you approach it and the role that you have as a social planner means that you have no right to be wrong. You are liable for the consequences of the problem, the effects that you have on the problem when you attempt to solve it. So that description, when Elliot invited me to be part of this panel, it was really easy for me to see how the work that I was doing in and with law enforcement agencies and police records fit the description of wicked problems. It was sort of like one of those things where, oh, I did not know about that, but now that you have talked about it, I know that I have that. It's like imposter syndrome. It's like, I don't know what that is, but I know I have it. And in the time that I've spent looking into and working with evidence management practices in law enforcement agencies and talking to people who do this work in and with a variety of different kinds of evidence, I've encountered a lot of metaphors, including this particularly colorful one from the property room manager at a college campus police department. And when I describe my work in the very broadest strokes, I use metaphorical language for that too. I say that I'm looking at property rooms as a form of archive and evidence management as a variety of archival practice. And other people work within, other people work with these metaphorical descriptions around evidence as well and have informed my work through their use of metaphor. Jennifer Mnuchin, who's our law school dean, and is a scholar of both evidence law and the history of science and technology, draws an explicit connection between figurative descriptions and categorical linkages. In categories are something that we are really obsessed with in information science, of course, and the extension or application of legal precedent to new forms of evidence. In her discussion of the history of photographic evidence and its integration into the justice system, Mnookin acknowledges that adding something to a category inevitably changes that category, just like trying to solve a problem changes the nature of the problem itself. And the use of similes is quite literally a process of assimilation. But assimilation is a two-way street, and ontologies, as we all know, are not dynamic, or are not fixed phenomena, they're dynamic ones. So we end up with something like a Rubik's Cube, where it's not just 6 colors on 6 sides, it's as many colors as you have squares, and every time you turn the cube, those colors change, those squares change color. So dynamism, as I mentioned before, is one of the features, a defining feature of a wicked problem. And the questions of how police body-worn cameras and the footage they create are assimilated into the physical spaces of property rooms as part of change in evidence and how it's created, or the functional spaces of record keeping and public policy, and how and by whom those records should be managed and accessed and used either on their own or in conjunction with other emerging technologies. I think you're beginning to see, along with me, how this constitutes a wicked problem. And it's three-dimensional, or actually four-dimensional, just like the records themselves are. So this fails, this Rubik's Cube metaphor fails as a metaphor for any wicked problem, though, because a Rubik's Cube, like a chess game or a math problem, ultimately does have a solution. It at least succeeds, though, in conveying how this is an issue with X, Y, and Z coordinates, multiple factors that are operating in space and time together. And it helps explain why forces that we would expect to find on the same side of an issue, like the ACLU and the Electronic Freedom Foundation, end up opposing one another when they talk about body-worn cameras, while privacy advocates and anti-surveillance groups now share policy positions with historical antagonists like police labor unions. And each twist changes the oppositions and conjunctions. Each tiny new affordance of technology changes the way we think about it and how it gets used. And it puts a frustrating new face on the problem. We keep twisting this little box. So bodycam video is a complex and poorly understood new element in a field of property and evidence management, which, as I found in my research, was complex and poorly understood to begin with. So again, it's problems leading into other problems. There's no way to tell where it begins and ends. The sociology of police and policing has for many decades focused primarily on patrol officers and to a lesser degree on agency leadership, which leaves property and evidence management a woefully understudied subject, which I should note, makes it a lot like archives. Again, the archival and record keeping functions of most organizations are black boxed and invisible to those working on the outside or asking questions about the history and current functions. So between 2012 and 2017, I collected and reviewed a corpus of over 400 law enforcement agency websites that do make the property and evidence management function visible in any degree. Either through a detailed profile of the property room and its staff, or a simple mention in an agency organizational chart like this one for the Gainesville, Florida Police Department, where you can locate the property and evidence section way down in the corner there, next to training and strategic planning and facilities and vehicles under the professional standards and support services division. Not part of operations or investigations, which seems significant in itself. The single phone number for an agency's property room, instructions for how to reclaim evidence that was seized in the course of an arrest or investigation. These are all some of the many ways in which property rooms become visible in agency websites. But a systematic review of those sites reveals that generalizing about evidence management as a function of law enforcement agencies is really difficult, in part because it can't consistently be located. It's often discernibly part of an agency's investigation or support divisions, as in the example I just showed, but it's much less frequently part of the records or operations divisions, and a good percentage of the time, almost more than a quarter of the time, it's just not possible to locate it structurally within the organization. It's not possible to say who is responsible for this, where is this in the chain of command. So conversations with property managers themselves also suggest that evidence management and the physical sites of evidence management as a function are very little thought of from the inside. They're invisible to people who work right next to it as well, unless and until something goes very wrong. When the system gets septic, you know, but until then, you just keep flushing that toilet and assume everything is fine. It's also highly localized and non-standardized as a practice, especially when it comes to recorded evidence. There are state-level mandates for the creation of recorded evidence in the form of court decisions with the force of law, or statutory requirements for recording of interrogations. The requirements for retention of that evidence are also set at the state level in the form of codes of criminal procedure or by separate agency level policies and standard operating procedures for different kinds of technology like dash cams, interview recordings, custody area surveillance, audio recorders, body-worn cameras, and so on. And police records laws or public records laws and municipal policies on open governance and open data in government, which may overlay or conflict with any or all of these policies, create additional procedural ambiguities for the courts to resolve upon appeal or trial. And there is, furthermore, a growing and discernible divide between the keepers of evidence that sits on a shelf and evidence that sits on a server. Archivists and records managers, especially those working for government entities, may find that all of these challenges describe their own work as well. So body-worn cameras are a uniquely invasive form of surveillance, and they create recordings that are uniquely voluminous and vulnerable, not to mention easily manipulated and transmitted. At the same time, the number of agencies adopting their use without having clear, comprehensive policies in place is extremely high. So to take just one recent example, the New York Civil Liberties Union submitted Freedom of Information Law or FOIL requests for departmental policies to 23 agencies across the state of New York in the summer of 2015. And just about, well, at the time I gave this talk, it was just about 3 weeks ago. So in July of 2018, they launched a Behind the Badge website intended to share the policies that they received in response to those requests, with commentary that highlights areas of potential concern or room for improvement. So this is a case where, again, wicked problems, people have different ways of describing what is going on. They expect to post additional policies from 16 more cities on the site towards the end of the year, well, now at the beginning of this year, and to continue to update the policies that were already posted as additional information becomes available or as those policies themselves are revised and rewritten. But the site itself shows how there's confusion about what body cams are even for. Are they for increasing accountability and transparency, or are they for reducing use of force, or are they for creating more reliable and authentic records of what happens when police interact with the public? It's unclear, too, whether body cams are actually effective at doing any of this, which means that they meet several of the other criteria of wickedness as defined by Riddle and Weber. Are body-worn cameras the solution to any of these problems, or are they the source of other problems? Spoiler alert, they are both. So what do we have going for us? What is positive about this? How do we not lose hope in the face of these problems? What can police and archivists productively share when it comes to this particular wicked problem or all of its little satellite problems? As I suggested previously, I think we can identify areas of common ground and parallel experience here, identify ourselves as being part of a community of practice. That metaphorical extension of the property room to the world of the archive is part of what I'm talking about. And for one thing, while audiovisual record making has become pervasive in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, archives and property rooms alike have only with difficulty integrated audiovisual materials into record keeping. They still sit aside from other forms of records. For another thing, the materials handled in archives are widely understood as having profound power and significance. And increasingly, the role of the property manager is understood and spoken of as carrying historical and emotional weight. Evidence collections are archives of trauma, and they continue to inflict trauma. They're full of things that are taken by force from people who will never get them back, and we need to take care of those things very seriously. We share with law enforcement agencies a need for better training, for more resources, for better tools for our practitioners to deal with this aspect of our work in order to reduce harm, not just to the keepers of records, but to their subjects and to the communities that they document. We share a need for internal advocacy and articulation of the value we contribute before things go wrong. We need somebody to help clean the toilet. There is also a movement toward professionalization and evidence management that is occurring in parallel with the movement toward feminization and civilianization in law enforcement, and the struggle for diversification of law enforcement personnel and recognition of the structural racism of police practice. This echoes the progress of the archival profession too. We're not that much further ahead of the police in this respect. And we operate with an attitude of critical practice in that realm of professionalism as well. We're hurt, in short, in many of the same ways and by many of the same trends. And it's possible, therefore, that we may be helped by some of the same remedies. As I noted at the beginning, the use of simile is a form of assimilation. If we acknowledge our likenesses, we may find ourselves categorically linked with and changed by the communities of practice we align ourselves with. And that would hopefully be to our mutual benefit. So conversations across communities are a necessary part of this, of understanding the wicked problems that we have and trying to come up with solutions for which we can be truly accountable. They're a source of not just information, but comfort. As I discovered when I spoke with a representative of Safariland, the maker of one of the leading body-worn camera platforms, the ViewView platform. Safariland as a company has actually been around for almost a century. They're known for their holster designs and body armor. And I asked, just out of curiosity, in the context of feminization and civilianization in policing, how having women wearing body armor and protective equipment is affecting law enforcement agencies. And the response was that all body armor is custom made. So it doesn't actually affect the situation that much, that every bulletproof vest, well, he also said, we don't call them bulletproof vests because nothing is bulletproof. That was enlightening and useful to hear. But the idea that, that everything was made to order was at first startling, and then it made perfect sense. All armor forever has been made to order. If you were a knight in the Middle Ages, your body armor had to be custom fitted and fitted very closely to within very narrow tolerances in order to allow of any kind of movement at all, let alone to be protective. So that was a source of comfort to me because this is a 1,000-year-old problem. It's not surprising that we have not fixed it or found a solution to it. Approaching the problems that we have as not just wicked, but enduring, and that is not a shortcoming on our part, but a reality that we simply must accept, takes some of the pressure off. So whether we think of ourselves as archivists versus evidence managers, or archivists as evidence managers, or the other way around, thinking of this as a problem that we will be engaging with for many years to come, as we have been engaging with it for many years already, I think is useful and comforting. And in closing, I want to address wickedness as a value-laden term, the idea of wicked versus good. When it comes to police, and especially to their use of body cams and other forms of invasive surveillance, I do think it's essential for us to resist simplistic readings and speculations about consequence that take us into Black Mirror and science fiction territory. I think to ask the important questions and to understand this issue on anything beyond a superficial level means engaging with people, institutions, and practices that we may find problematic or even repugnant. I am neither apologist nor abolitionist when it comes to the police. I personally find that moral clarity is really hard to come by when I do this work. And I especially want, on a personal level, to see the racist and hypermasculine and increasingly militarized aspects of policing as we know it in America to come to an end. I don't believe I have the power, nor do I yet have the inclination to utterly explode that structure. But I clearly, as a white woman with a sort of stereotypically librarian and harmless presenting aspect, I clearly have certain privileges that can get me past the door. I have questions that only the people beyond that door can answer. And I want to open up the black box of the evidence management process. Having done so, it's my obligation now to keep my foot in that doorway, to maybe let a little crack of light in, or as it may be, to show others where they can come in and set the charges of more radical practice. Thank you.